Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of the many webinars that we do that discusses a whole series of issues, often national and often local. But we also do global issues as well, and that's what we're going to concentrate on today. And we've got with us Amelia Hadfield, who's going to talk to us about that. She's going to talk about, we're going to ask her questions on, I hope she's going to talk about it, global governance in crisis. And we're going to look at a particular model, the Commonwealth Model, and see if that provides a way forward for reforming global governance in a way that would make it more effective. So let's start then, Amelia, if we could, by just asking you a question that you could perhaps answer briefly. Tell people a little about yourself so they get some idea who you are and where you've come from.
Thanks, no problem. Well, as you'll instantly hear from my accent, I'm Canadian. So my parents are British. They emigrated to Canada, so I'm dual nationality. And I think as a result, what we're going to be speaking about this evening is very dear to my heart, and that's, of course, the Commonwealth. My area of expertise, if I can call it that, broadly speaking, is foreign policy. Within that, I specialize in European and British foreign and security relations. That's a pretty broad area, and that is, I think it can probably be reduced to security and defense, things like NATO, where Europe is going in terms of its strategic autonomy. But more broadly, in terms of global governance and the study of international organizations, which is something that I've been teaching on for a long time, it means I get the infinite joy of finding out about international organizations in the world, like the Commonwealth. I've been a strong supporter of it, not just because I enjoy researching on it, but I enjoy teaching on it. So I've added it as a week in my international organizations class, which I teach now at the University of Surrey. And at Surrey, I'm the head of the Department of Politics. I should also say that for many, many years, I've been a member of the MOOT, the advisory board of the Round Table, which is the Journal of Commonwealth Studies. In fact, it's the oldest international relations journal in the world, more than 100 years now. And its ability, I think, to speak to the changes of the Commonwealth as a whole and the nature of governance and potential reforms, which I imagine we'll be speaking about this evening, I think is incredibly important. So for those of you who want more information, definitely check out the Roundtable Journal. Okay,
well, that's quite a lot you told us about. So that's great, because we know what you do and what your background is. But we're going to talk about global governance today, and many people would say that it's in a sorry state. And today, especially, it's an auspicious day. It's November the 3rd. It's the American election. And whoever wins, and we won't know that till tomorrow or even after that, whoever wins, what impact do you think it will have on the state of global governance, which we today, many think is not fit for purpose?
That's a great question to begin with. And it is very auspicious this evening. I think, it's fairly stark in terms of the division of evidence and probably opinion. Trump's impact on the world, for the most part, I think in the last 4 years has not been one who is a friend to global governance in general. I think supportive diplomacy, supportive cooperation, and particularly I think supportive multilateralism has been seriously lacking there. Trump's take is very much the sort of the art of the deal. So bilateral at most, really. There's that, I'm reminded of that famous picture of him, I think at the G7 summit a couple of years ago, sitting cross-armed with sort of beseeching leaders around him, trying to get him to change his mind. And I think it speaks volumes to the sort of administration's perspective at that point of just either disengagement completely from global governance in areas like international organizations, including NATO and the EU and the UN. But I think more specifically, the America First philosophy, whereby, they don't need friends. They're quite prepared to either to go it alone internationally or to turn inwards and have it sort of purely domestic. So I guess I think hopes are high for those who have an international or cosmopolitan bent and who feel that global governance is, as you say, Francis, in a sorry state. And the sense is that, Biden, should he become president, will be far better for the state of the world in intergovernmental terms and supranational terms.
Okay, so let's look at what's gone wrong. I mean, after the Second World War, and the carnage of the Second World War. The United Nations was formed, and people had great hope of that. Bretton Woods saw the IMF and the World Bank formed. So we had these international institutions which people thought would give us a new future, would give us stability. What's gone wrong? Because those now are meeting a huge amount of criticism. Why are we facing that now in this day?
That's a really giant question, and it does take, I think, studying international organizations to understand some of the reasons why perhaps the policy cycle, as we call it, has broken down in some of these. I think in many ways it might have to do with just general trust that organizations are a public good, that they operate depending on what they've been founded for, whether it's the IMF or the WTO or the United Nations or NATO, whatever theme they specialize in, that they do an adequate job of representing that in terms of the theme itself, but also generating collective government, getting other governments around the world to sit around the table, to provide money, to provide resources, to sign treaties, to abide by commitments. And I think one of the hallmarks of the 21st century has been a creeping cynicism that international organizations from the 1945 period onwards, and the reason that they were put there to begin with, which is, of course, to keep the peace, are either obsolete and not fit for purpose, or if they're still needed, they're in such dire need of reform that only major overhauls are going to be required. And all it takes is a president like Trump, I think, to say that none of them are fit for purpose, and that they are seen to sort of circumvent what they were set up to do originally, or that they simply are minuscule, but in proportion to something as large as the United States, and can afford to be ignored effectively. I think that's a problem, because the majority of the organizations that you referred to, that I'm speaking about right now, I think are fit for purpose. They are, of course, in need of genuine reform, and the Commonwealth is no different. But to my mind, we do still live in a multipolar world, in a world made up of institutions and governments, of individuals and communities, of public and private sector, of markets and commodities. And I think that the best way to continue to structure that in a stable and predictable way is really making sure that institutions reflect the needs of sovereign states at this point. We're going to need organizations as long as we have sovereign states, and we are not anywhere close to getting rid of the sovereign state at this point.
I mean, that may be true, and you may say that institutions have to reflect what people feel and what people want, but it's not just about Trump, is it? The anger that's being felt against the institutions, what people call the elite of the world, has been going for a long time. I remember reading a book called The Harvest of Rage about the Clinton administration and what people felt in the Middle West. We've seen Brexit here. There is a growing populism and nationalism, which is also challenging the idea of global governance as well, isn't it?
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, I think there are two sort of polar opposites in terms of tensions. I think you have a sort of cosmopolitan push, which it has a liberal construct, has a liberal foundation, has a great trust in international organizations, and lays great faith in things like international law and states' abilities to speak to each other. The problem is a lot of that pattern, those patterns aren't clear to many people. It's not necessarily, obvious what the treaties are, what the laws are, what the agreements are. These are complicated and to many people's eyes invisible, apart from the effects. And if the effects wind up being sort of protracted unemployment or the outsourcing of jobs with no real explanation apart from, it's growing China, or it's the IMF, or it's the WTO, you can quite understand frustration in the Rust Belt in the United States, in key areas in the European Union, that the institutions are ungovernable or unrepresentative, or don't seem to have a proper solution for the lived reality of genuine, real people, so to speak. And the opposite of that, of course, or I suppose the outcome, is the sort of more communitarian-based, populist-based, identity-based. And that identity is very, very local. It's entirely about the individual sort of being pitted against another, against the elite, for example, or possibly being pitted against these series of increasingly faceless institutions. And it's very easy to kind of depict them as faceless and ungovernable and, unrepresentative in the extreme. Populism in the United States, Brexit, in Britain, the volatility I think we've seen in terms of populism in the European Union, and various other places, the Philippines and Venezuela, for example. They're all representing that same trend that you've mentioned, Francis. So I'm glad you brought that up. And it's a terrible tension between the two.
Well, those tensions are dangerous, aren't they? In a world of climate change and pandemics and nuclear proliferation, we're really in a dangerous situation.
Nuclear proliferation is a tough one. I mean, that really is down to the particularist sort of regional ambitions, if you like, of key states and the sort of must-have arsenal. I think, to be honest, we're past the tipping point when it was at its worst during the Cold War. And I think the work of sort of lesser well-known institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a branch of the United Nations and based in Vienna, actually are very good at being watchdogs and, making really sure that states commit clearly. On the other side, you've got major breaches of treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and large states feeling that they don't need to be bound by small laws or small rules and regulations. So there will always be a degree of anarchy, in the state system. I think when you study this is known as realism or sometimes hyper-realism. But this generally tends to be balanced by stability based in codification and rules and laws and international institutions. And that's the sort of, liberal counterpart, if you like. What's difficult is there seems, as I said before, to be genuine sort of mistrust in why the institutions continue now, possibly beyond the initial rationale of their founding, and also the way in which they should be reformed to represent, the current needs of the 21st century, because you're talking 2-3 generations now between their initial constructs, and even with the European Union itself, I tend to still think of it as a new actor, but I think in a sense it's come of age, and not in ways that we would have expected, and not in ways perhaps that many people feel actually helps them as private citizens. And the Commonwealth is another example, I think, for many people, for people who aren't necessarily aware of what it does internally and externally. Either it's a British holdover, it should have been scrapped long ago, or it does when people aren't aware.
Let's go on to the Commonwealth then, because that's what we want to talk about as well. And you mentioned that. I mean, the Commonwealth is a slightly different model to the United Nations, the way it's structured and the way citizens and governments interact with each other. Do you think that's a possible model for the reform of global governance in general?
I think the Commonwealth is a sort of unsung hero because it works in many ways very effectively and very quietly. I think for some it's too quiet because you don't see enough impact around the world. But for others, I think if I just say the Commonwealth Games, actually there is real instant recognition of the way in which 50 plus countries work together. So I would like to suggest that it is because of the sort of multi-purpose structure, which I think to a critical eye might look somewhat unwieldy, but to an eye that's willing to permit a degree, if you like, of a slightly motley combination of different people doing different things, I think it might work very, very well. So one of the problems, I think, with very structured international organizations is cracks can appear in the procedures, or questions can appear over the substance. And something that I think the Commonwealth has done quite well is to develop a variety of different themes in terms of parliamentary reform and youth and climate change, for example, and a variety of different structures on which to pin them. So you have not just the meeting of the heads of states every couple of years, but you have the Secretariat, you have the Foundation, you have the Royal Commonwealth Society, you have the Commonwealth Games. So there's kind of like a super brand, a kind of Commonwealth super brand, and there's these sort of micro brands underneath it. And I think the idea is that everybody who's a part of this can either feel that they're connected as Commonwealth citizens, or they're celebrating some of the anniversaries in terms of achievements, albeit quiet, within the Commonwealth, or perhaps the way in which the Commonwealth works really quite well with the foreign ministries or the high commissions of all of the Commonwealth countries. So I think in a sense, it is that flexible system that allows it to do lots of different things in different places around the world, usually with a high degree of efficacy. In fact, perhaps something that might strike people as rather boring, the idea of making really sure that parliamentary procedures are well understood, in putting together a parliament or reforming a parliament or writing a constitution. I mean, where would you naturally go if you wanted to build a parliament or write your own constitution? I mean, you have to start looking it up online, and you'd have to sort of start talking to people who have done this for hundreds of years. And yet in the Commonwealth, you sort of have this ready repository of states, which have built themselves up as national communities and have exchanged a sort of variety of good practice, if you like, under the aegis of the Commonwealth, the way in which they, typically govern themselves. That's something incredibly unusual. Almost no other sort of organization in the world does that.
Okay, well, we could look at that, and I agree with you, but how do you sell it? Because we have a colleague on the Global Net site who is a Russian, and she says, we have to, she looks on the Commonwealth, and she says, we're trying to create a new model of dominance based on Western ideas, Western structures. She says, in Russia, we've got BRICS, we've got a different structure as well. And here you are coming up in the West with another structure. And, that isn't really what we should be doing. We shouldn't be trying to create a new world order based upon the Western model. So how do you sell it to the rest of the world? Don't you need to rename it, not say it's a Western Commonwealth model?
Well, I don't think it is. First of all, there are 4 Commonwealths. There's the Commonwealth of Nations, just simply known as the Commonwealth, which is a political association of, I think it's 54 member states, nearly all of them former territories of what was the British Empire. But you have the Francophonie, which is the French equivalent, and you have a Spanish version and a Portuguese version as well. I think the key is it's not actually Western at all, because you have a whole series of different types around the world of governments sitting together. Intergovernmentalism. And that aspect is at the very, very heart, I think, of the Commonwealth. Also, let's bear in mind that big chunks of what the Commonwealth does is charitable in many ways. The Commonwealth Foundation, for example, and the support of values is something that is global and not in any sense Western. So the stated shared values of Commonwealth members, I think, are also supported by non-Commonwealth members. So democracy, human rights, the rule of law, those are enshrined in the Commonwealth Charter, and they're promoted by things like the Commonwealth Games, as you would find them in any other constitution around the world. I think what's special is, first of all, the sheer size. The countries of the Commonwealth themselves are a third of the global population, but they encapsulate North and South, East and West, developed and developing economies as well. So that is a very unusual grouping to bring together. I think it's a helpfully critical organization because it puts front and center the uneasy truths of acquisition of power, and what happens when a power structure like empire necessarily falls apart, and the self-governance that follows those sorts of structures as well. So republics, new commonwealths, states, regions, all of these are 20th century and 21st century examples of the forward motion of how we govern ourselves. To that, I should add that there's something, of course, really unique about the Commonwealth, as well as supporting things like the games and sports, the support for youth, and the support particularly, I think, for climate change is very, very important. So it allows the Commonwealth to be seen as singularly worldwide representative. So some of the work that in terms of sustainable development in sub-Saharan Africa is a really good example, but I think the support for deforestation and particularly the work in the oceans, keeping the oceans clear, these are enormous, very cross-border challenges, and you need something as large as the Commonwealth, or I dare say the United Nations, that big to tackle a problem that endemic. So I would really dispute the idea that it's singularly Western when the goals themselves are very global.
Okay, I guess you would say that, wouldn't you? Because you're Canadian and you're part of the Commonwealth. There you go. But, when you look at the Commonwealth, there are 3 intergovernmental organisations out there. There's Commonwealth Secretariat, Commonwealth Foundation, and you mentioned those 2. One is about intergovernmental cooperation, the other is about citizen collaboration, and there is also the Commonwealth of Learning. And you're a Canadian, and you might be very interested in that because it's based in Canada. And you talked about climate change and actually learning about different things and the way people collaborate and work with each other in different cultures. having those three structures in a more informal way than the United Nations does, which has it in a very bureaucratic, institutional way, is that what you're saying is a way forward, is important?
I think so. I think you have to sort of look at ways in which an organization does different things for different people, achieves goals for different communities, and the flexibility that those sort of separate entities have in order to be able to kind of run their own program, so to speak. So you've mentioned the Commonwealth of Learning again. So that is, you're quite right. That's headquartered in Vancouver, in British Columbia, in Canada. And what that does is it very collaboratively works with government and non-governmental organizations, which is always a tough sell at the best of times, and other institutions in the Commonwealth. And the mandate, I mean, their philosophy, of course, is to promote not just knowledge in general, but open learning. So open access, and particularly in the world of big data that we live in. So I think that is incredibly important. That keys you into things like distance learning, knowledge access, resources, technology. So it's gone from something that sounds a little dusty and dry in terms of the classroom to actually, cutting edge pedagogy. So to have, that number of states joining with that number of non-governmental organizations to promote something as important as learning, and by doing so to promote the role of youth and the exchange of good practices, I think is incredibly important. So that's quite a cool thing, I think, that the Commonwealth does. I'll go back again, if I may, to the Commonwealth Games, because the idea of sport, the governance of sport, if you like, drawing people together and using sort of soft power to promote good diplomacy in the world, is very much part and parcel, I think, of good governance, good global governance in the 21st century as a whole. I think those are sort of earmarked by specialist areas, specialist jobs, but done with real excellence.
There is also, isn't there, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and Stephen Twigg, who used to be our MP, is now the General Secretary of that. Now, how, what value is that you bring legislatures together, you bring decision makers together at a parliamentary and congressional level? Not Congress, they're not in the Commonwealth, are they? They might be. You never know what Trump will do tomorrow. He might join the Commonwealth, but you bring those decision makers together.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't happen in the same way in the United Nations that it does in the Commonwealth, does it?
Yeah. You're bringing two sets of people together. I think you're bringing decision makers, but you're also bringing civil servants, crucially. So you have to bring, it's a sort of combination of the Whitehall and the Westminster together. It's very valuable because a parliament is a living thing. And I mean, none more so alive, I think, than the British one, which, as we've seen just in the past couple of years, has really gone from a chamber of robust adversarial debate on a quiet day, to being challenged in the High Court with regards to the legitimacy of something like prorogation. So the way in which parliaments represent the will of the people, articulate this through policy, codify it in law, sounds sort of kind of a simple thing for me to say it now, but it's based on the most incredibly complicated series of rules and regulations, and everybody around the world both does it similarly and does it differently. So the idea of getting decision makers who head up the policies and the civil servants who are really in charge of implementing those policies in a material fashion together to exchange views, to find out what works, to find out what doesn't, especially on new emerging areas. Let's think about health policy. I mean, where are we now in the COVID age versus where we were a year ago? Would we ever have imagined cross-parliamentary exchange on how you put together decent global health policy or even local health policy? So to my mind, the Commonwealth affords a genuine benefit to global governance by providing civil servants and parliamentarians alike a forum in which they can exchange best practice. The fact that it has a youth wing, I think, is especially helpful because it prevents Parliament perhaps from sliding into that possibly unintended identity of being a rather fusty chamber when it's anything but.
You can write papers saying how great the Commonwealth model is and how it could add a great deal to global governance, and that's good. But the big question is, how do you move from the paper to the practice? How do you actually get that model instituted? I mean, the United Nations is there. It's not fit for purpose, some people say. There's another model you think is possible. But how do we get people to accept we need that model? And how do you go about doing it?
I think, first of all, just accepting the precept that states can work together peaceably and that genuinely good cooperation can flow from that. So if you can stick behind the philosophy of intergovernmentalism, for the most part, then the Commonwealth model itself has basically, that's box number one ticked. There are a lot of areas for reform, though. I have to say that. I think the way perhaps in which the Commonwealth Secretariat has been run seems to many people opaque. May not necessarily resemble, the beating heart of something as exciting and as responsive as the Commonwealth. I think also the work that the Commonwealth Foundation does, which is, I think, exceptionally helpful, isn't well enough triumphed. So like many organizations, the Commonwealth does a lot of good, but isn't terribly good at its own PR and needs to sort of capture that. If it can do that in tandem with clarifying that initial commitment to the philosophy of intergovernmentalism, I think you're sort of halfway there. But I will say, Francis, you put your finger on it. It's very easy for people to write, glowing accolades and papers full of unicorns and rainbows about the Commonwealth. But the idea of delivery on projects to people and communities, to citizens themselves, I think that's really, really important. And that means that every member state of the Commonwealth needs, to use a Canadian expression, they need to pony up the dough. They have to be committed politically, and they have to be able to back it financially in order for each of them to deliver millions and millions of dollars and pounds worth of projects for their citizens as Commonwealth citizens. So I think that's really important, whether it's sort of COVID-related sort of rescue packages or supplementing the youth or the knowledge Commonwealth that we were discussing before. I think that's important. Also, it's helpful to identify anniversaries and games, etc., like that. It's these big events, I think, that allow a tremendous visibility at regular points in the international calendar, and to say, oh yes, the Commonwealth's having an anniversary, or did you know it's the 70th anniversary of this or that, or a white paper is going to be released. It's something which, if you're teaching, is very helpful, because you can point this out to students and it gives them something of a hook, and opens a door, hopefully, in their mind to the exciting world of intergovernmentalism in general. And then you can say, oh, here's an exciting case study, the Commonwealth. Let's look at that today. What does it do well? What does it do not so well?
Yeah, the importance of festivals and ritual, it's important in every society. Okay, we get close to the end of 30 minutes, and we do live in turbulent times, and who knows, after tomorrow we may live in even more turbulent times. And you think that there is a model that could benefit the world. We're not sure how we're going to put that into practice, but are you optimistic that the world will survive? Forget extinction and climate change for a moment, but are you happy? Are you optimistic that the world will carry on and we will find a way of working together?
I am.
That's better than the one we have at the moment.
I think I have to be, because I have a duty of care to students, and I don't want them walking suicidally out of the classroom, convinced that the world's going to end tomorrow. I won't say that we haven't approached a couple of tipping points, including on climate change, that really fill me with horror. But I will say that people like Greta Thunberg fill me with real optimism and hope. So we have young prophets, I think, who are very clearly shouting at us and saying it's not good enough. And the where that's not good enough, that's twofold. That's in countries and states where we need to do better. And it's in the organizations that those states themselves build and are members of, where we should and ought, as citizens, to demand more. We should demand more of these institutions. They need to be able to be more clear in terms of their role as public goods. But also, again, as I said before, that connectivity between what are generally very laudable goals and making it real in terms of practice to people's lives. I think if that can happen, then I'll continue to be an optimist.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? Making it real to people's lives. If you say it's a great thing and you're selling it to your students, Plato might call it a noble lie, but it's not if you actually concentrate on the practical. And so how do you get that practical concentrated on? So your students will go out and want to make a difference, think they can do something, and take up projects that will help towards the end that you think is important.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can provide patterns. You can do it in the classroom by providing them with something like a briefing note. So I prefer to give my students, rather than this typical boring essay, I'll say, listen, I want you to pretend that you are writing something for the Secretary General of the United Nations. You've got an hour to do it. off you go, because that's quite a tool. I think that's a skill. And also the way in which they have to sort of personify that challenge, and the institution, within which you'd find that challenge, I think is really exciting. And there's a mindset there that can really galvanize students and really set them onto the trail of wanting to become diplomats or just working in international organizations more generally. The other pattern, of course, is encouraging students when they're studying to do a placement, to do a little bit of work in the real world, so that they don't go into this sort of nether region of study and forget about the very real pressures and stresses of what it's like to be a person, a citizen. I think it's important if you have placements in international organizations while you're studying, you get the very best of both worlds. You get the theories and the concepts by which these organizations were set up to begin with, but the experiential, practical, day-to-day tools and skills of actually making it run if you were in charge of a given unit. And then if you come out, I think you can understand why they continue to do well and where they don't, where they're falling down, and to really refine that philosophy of reform.
And, we come to the end, but if anybody wants to know more about your ideas, even contact you about the Commonwealth Model and so on, where would they go to find out?
Well, they can come to beautiful downtown Guildford. They can come and contact me at the University of Surrey, at the Department of Politics. So I tweet regularly, Amelia Hadfield 1, and also at Surrey Politics. We also have a Centre for Britain and Europe, where we do an awful lot of research on international organizations, and a Centre for International Intervention. So don't be a stranger. Come knocking.
Thanks very much for doing that, Amelia. I think that's a lot of interesting ideas. And I think a lot of people don't think of the Commonwealth as a model for global governance. They think it's something that's grown out of the British Empire, and they don't think it's changed in the way that it has with all the attributes you've said. So I think you've given a lot of people a lot of ideas to think about, and a lot of practical ways that we can move towards that more collaborative, less bureaucratic, less structured world. So thank you for joining us and doing that. And we'll end this interview now.